Welcome back. We're here on episode 2. We're talking about building Bitcoin. Episode 1, we talked about what is money, the basics of money, talked about the history of money, and now we're moving forward into Bitcoin. I'm Ryan Harper with Michael Lewin. Thank you so much for being here, and let's get after it.
All right, everyone, welcome. We're going to be talking Bitcoin. We've learned what money is and why we might want alternative forms of it, especially today. So ultimately, what are those alternatives? Well, Bitcoin is one of them, but where did Bitcoin come from? How did it come to be? This is where we're going to break it all down.
Because I think there's a lot of mystique. Satoshi.
Oh, yeah. Well, and even what came before Satoshi. I think that's the thing. Everyone thinks that Bitcoin just came into existence in 2008 after someone had worked on it kind of in the dark shadows, and it was brought forth into the world. But in reality, there's actually a lot of things that were done prior that led to Bitcoin's creation out in the open.
Yeah, because building Bitcoin, we ended the last episode on Nixon. I don't know if you noticed, Nixon's been gone a minute.
Yep. Yeah, and from there, the monetary system continued. But one change that had occurred right before Nixon, but it really took off afterwards, was digital payments. And that's ultimately where kind of Bitcoin begins, as we suddenly started building out this world where computers and the internet started to define who owned what money. Mm-hmm. And that's a system that we rely on very heavily today. So how did we get to that point? Because it used to be banks kind of in person, writing a check, talking to a bank teller, giving you cash. That was the system that you actually rely on for moving money around. How did it change to the point where we now do it on our phones? And that's where kind of the growth of computers mirrors the way that something like Bitcoin eventually became possible. So the first thing is we had the first computer-based check processing, essentially. In 1955, this was around the time that computers were just becoming commonplace. We had just came out of World War II where we used them for code breaking. Now people start looking for business applications. One of them was, we have a lot of check processing where we're just checking numbers and checking accounts. Let's just let a computer do that. So Bank of America was one of the first that created a computer for that. It was very large and very inefficient by today's standards, but still far more efficient than humans at the time.
It makes, it's funny because, again, I'm sure I'll be saying this over and over and over, like, oh, I didn't know that. Well, of course I didn't know it. It's a very niche thing. But it makes complete sense that the banks would be one of the first industries to take advantage of, like, computing.
Yep.
Especially when, check processing. It's just like, well, no crap, Ryan. Duh.
Yep, and usually all this computation was being done by hands and by clerks typically. So now you actually got a system where the computer can do the majority of that, and the human just has to be there to insert the information and take it out and then do whatever is necessary from there.
Right.
So after that, we continue to see more digitization occur. So Visa, a credit card used to not be digital entirely. It was actually, you had a card, you show up to a store and you say, hey, here's my card, and the clerk would write down, okay, this card is something I accept. You now owe me $20 for whatever purchase I made, and then they would kind of submit those at the end of the month, and they'd get the money in like one lump sum. So it wasn't digital at all, which means, you could make some fraudulent credit cards and potentially, and not only is there potential for fraud, but the settlement takes forever. It takes a month or two for you to actually get that money in.
Well, history lessons, like, when's the last time you saw somebody put the card on the carbon paper and do the thing over it? Yep. I haven't seen one of those in, 10 years or so? It's been a minute.
Yep, computers can handle that now, but it used to be that you had to rely on an entire paper trail to keep track of what money was owed to you. So eventually credit cards like Visa started to digitize their system so that now you could process it in less than a minute. I think using actually telephone lines in the beginning to actually send that information out and then get a confirmation back. So now you're not trusting that this person in front of you is actually going to pay you back because they give you a false card or they just decide to take a hike. Now you actually get a confirmation back that this credit is good and this is a payment that you can trust. And so from there, we continue to see digitization and the internet. So now the internet's been born, Tim Berners-Lee creates the first website, and now there's this potential for you to not only do payments digitally, but also online. And so Pizza Hut was the first big company to accept order payments online. Funny to see pizza companies involved in some of the first digital payments.
Yeah.
Well, hey, when you're hungry at 2 a.m., it's better to use the internet.
It's just it's just so funny because everything we've talked about, it seems very high level. We talked about World War I, World War II, Nixon, first computers, Bank of America, and then Pizza Hut.
Yep. Pizza Hut.
They're in high company.
They were one of the first. They were at the forefront of digital payments, and then from there, like a couple years later, we had the first online bank. So now you don't have a branch that you go to. You don't have a teller. Prior to that, everyone thought of a bank as a physical thing.
Right.
And now you finally have one of the first online banks where all the ways you interact with it, all the ways you get your money is in person. Or at the very least by mail, but you don't have to have that physical interaction any longer.
And that's obviously seems like it's flipped, where it's like, yeah, I could go to my local Chase Bank, but I'd rather just pop up the app or go on the website.
Yeah, I mean, you can deposit your checks just through your phone now. You take a
Right.
picture and that's
Right.
all it needs. So check processing has come very far from where it used to be. And then after that, Coca-Cola starts offering mobile payments using text. So you can text someone and potentially pay for, I don't actually know what they were paying for. I just know they were the first one using text.
Yeah, I'm trying to think, like, what are you going to, mobile payment over your phone for a Coke?
Yeah. Something like that. Maybe get your Coke delivered, something. I assume it was probably promotional, but you can see that a lot of big companies want
Now
to
they're
play
in the
with it.
history books.
Yep.
Right beside Pizza Hut.
That was, I'm sure, part of the idea.
Yeah.
And then now we're at the point where electronic payments make up 2/3 of all non-cash payments. If you're paying for something, more than likely you're doing it online. Like very rarely do you see these physical cash or even check or anything else kind of payment.
Well, I mean, if I'm buying something from you on Facebook Marketplace and we're meeting in person, I'm probably just going to Zelle right then and there.
Yep.
Or, hey, let me scan your Venmo right then and there.
Yeah.
It's probably not going to be actual cash, because if it's actual cash, there's a risk of, well, maybe they might mug me.
Yeah. Well, and even then, there's the other kind of motivation, which is like, how much do people even carry that much cash nowadays? I mean, now it used to be you always got, you were using cash enough that you had some decent cash either on hand or like maybe sitting at home somewhere safe. But it's at the point where, if I wanted to go make a large cash purchase online, I might just have to go to an ATM first. And at that point, why not just do it online?
Like, I think I have like $54 in my wallet, and that's only because in a small group, I was the one that bought pizza, and everybody just gave me, a couple bucks, $50 or whatever. And it's like, oh, now I have cash. And that cash will be there until I'm probably paying somebody my $20 for pizza or whatever.
Yep.
So again, I've never used cash.
Yep. It's at that point where, like, especially with the pandemic now, everyone's like, it's at the point where cash is considered a disease carrying in some context.
My biggest annoyance is when you go somewhere and you have to pay for parking, and it's still a metered parking, and they don't have the app parking.
Yeah. Yeah. Then
You're like, I don't have coins.
Yep.
Then you're like digging under the seat of the car.
There's a national coin shortage right now too. They're actually
how is that possible?
Yeah. They're specifically saying we don't want, we would prefer at least not cash or coin. We want card because you don't have to worry about being replenished.
But where's the coins going?
That's a good question. I don't know. Apparently not being hoarded somewhere. I'm not sure. That's a good question.
Right?
Yeah, we'll see. But yeah, and then from there,
It's another podcast.
Yeah, another podcast. But what the problem in digital payments that you end up coming up with is someone's controlling that payment. You're trusting a bank, you're trusting Visa or PayPal, and it's being tracked. And ultimately, you can potentially be told by one of those entities that you're not allowed to transact. You can be kicked out of PayPal, for example. If they don't like you, you can be kicked out of a bank for no reason. In the sense that, and this has happened to me, and I know the reason, it was probably because I use cryptocurrency or I do cryptocurrency business. But you can receive a letter in the mail that a bank says, we will no longer be doing business with you.
Well, think of all those, like in Colorado and Oregon and California, where they have all these like marijuana type businesses, like the I don't know, what are they called, dispensaries or whatever?
Yes, exactly.
So they have a very cash abundant business, and they're not allowed to put it in the bank because they don't want the federal government to seize it.
Yep.
Because even though the state says it's legal, the government still says it's not legal. So therefore, well, if we put it there, they're just going to seize it.
Yep. So for a legal technicality, you're basically completely cut off from financial services, and that exists for
Right.
people that are undocumented, and it exists for people that are just in industries. I mean, even gas stations sometimes can have trouble getting a bank account because they're so cash heavy, and banks don't really like to deal with large cash heavy customers. It's more work for them in a digital world. They can either struggle to get bank services, or they're suspected of money laundering. Because what are you sneaking into that cash payment that we can't track?
Well, ultimately, it comes down to it's almost like people get Facebook or YouTube or Twitter, issues, but it's like, well, they're private companies. They can do whatever. If they don't want you,
Yeah.
they don't want you. So when it comes to money, when it comes to cash, when it comes to transactions, we like to think it's like, well, my money's good everywhere. But like you said, some banks, it's not good here.
Yep.
And then you're literally cut off.
Yep. And that's ultimately the problem is you can, every bank in the world could say no to you, and as long as you can't prove it was specifically discriminatory, they don't have to give a reason.
Right.
And that's really the area we live in now. And so for people that want to engage online, or maybe they don't want to pay 3% on every transaction, that's another thing that most payment services, especially if it's for business. Notice in Venmo, it has this little check mark you can make where it says, was this personal payment or was this a business payment? If it's a business payment, they'll charge the person making that purchase. Or the person receiving it, I believe. But in any case, in their whole thing as well.
That's why all my Venmo is personal.
Yeah. Well, and they'll say, we'll give you protection. If they cheat you, we'll reverse it. They kind of provide, I guess, a bit of protection there. But then, of course, they're also the ones deciding who's right and who's wrong, which is a large amount of power. It's happened before on eBay or other providers where, someone says, I never got the good, even though they did. And PayPal says, well, we're just going to trust this buyer because we want to keep buyers using the platform, and the seller gets screwed.
Well, there's been times where, as a buyer, I was getting screwed, and I actually had to go through the whole police, that's a random tangent, but I had to get the police report and everything.
Yep.
And the police were like, so what happened? Like, I didn't get a package. Then why do you need a police report? Because they won't refund my money unless there's a police report.
Yeah. There's a lot of this dispute resolution that
was
has
it
to
stolen?
happen.
Like, no, it was never delivered.
Yep.
Anyway.
But there are situations where if you're doing that and you don't trust someone, you would prefer to have an instant settlement. You'd prefer to know that once they pay me, I'm good, and they can't come back claiming something else, at least in the right circumstance where that's like kind of above board. But it's like a case where that doesn't exist online. There's no way for me to instantly settle. I'm always trusting someone like PayPal. And PayPal, you don't get your money immediately. There's like a 30 to 60 day waiting period. Mm-hmm. So there's a kind of a lot of friction in doing payments online that a lot of people don't get to see, especially on the business side, but even on the personal side.
So
sometimes.
Are you ready for a very stupid question?
Yes.
What is Visa? What is Mastercard? Because it seems like there's a ton of different credit cards, but they're all under the umbrella of Visa or Mastercard. So is Visa a company? Is Visa like the Federal Reserve of that credit?
I would say they're kind of they're a platform for creating credit cards, and they have a payment network. So basically, you create a credit card and you're some financial company, you partner with Visa to say, I want to use your network. You have a payment network, and most places will accept Visa, they'll accept Mastercard, and maybe American Express, maybe Discover. And those are like the four. That's it. If all four of them say, we don't want to support your credit card, you don't have a credit card.
So Visa, Mastercard, or American Express or Discover, those are like the highways.
Yes.
And like your trucking or maybe that's wrong, but you know what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah.
Where it's like, hey, we're the railway network, and then Capital One, it's its own little train line or something like that.
Something similar to that, and it gets
You
more
see where I'm going with
complicated.
that?
Yes, and
Yeah.
it gets even more complicated because there's other layers and parties involved that we never really get exposure to.
Right.
But there's like the payments network industry is it's almost like a hierarchical pyramid.
Right.
Almost, I want to say pyramid scheme. It's not necessarily scheme, but there's definitely a rate of like, they pay these many fees, and as you go further down, there's different fee collections where someone's making a cut. And so when I make a payment to you through a credit card, there could be multiple parties involved we have no knowledge of, but they're ultimately one of the reasons that we might have to pay 3 to 4% on that transaction.
And it may seem like, well, Ryan, why are you bringing that up? Well, I'm bringing it up because I'm trying to give you a layup later when you're like, well, Bitcoin is there. It is. It's easy.
Yeah.
So,
Well, exactly, and that's ultimately what some people want. Like maybe I do want protection for credit in some cases, but there's other cases where I just want to make a payment direct and I want it to go through and be done. I don't want to have to worry about different counterparties and potentially one of them messing up, which can happen on occasion, or someone not being trustworthy or creditworthy and have a waiting period. All these things, I just want payment from A to B.
Well, and again, when we were talking about Visa and with all those different layers, well, you say layers, I hear hands in cookie jars.
Yes, absolutely. And in their eyes, and in some potential cases, they're doing a service. But in a lot of cases, if I'm just wanting to pay you, going through 3 to 4 different parties to do a simple transaction doesn't make sense. I don't need them involved. I just want to give you value for something you're providing to me. And that's ultimately where a digital cash system can come in.
Excellent.
And so let's get into the origins of Bitcoin and start talking about cypherpunks. So
I have been hearing this a lot lately,
Yeah.
mainly because of NFTs. and I have no clue what it is.
So Cypherpunks is a political movement that I think really you want to get into the head of a cypherpunk to understand why Bitcoin became a thing, because that's ultimately where the political kind of origins of Bitcoin come from. Kind of these, you could call them almost like crypto anarchists, but really what they were people that believed you could provide freedom online or digital freedom without anyone else guaranteeing it. You don't need the government, you don't need a company, you don't need anyone but technology to provide freedom to people. And that was kind of the essence of a CryptoPunk. So they believed that you should have online freedom and privacy, that you should have a right to not be identified online if you didn't choose to be. So I could transact with someone without having to say, my name is Michael Llewellyn, just because I wanted to maybe like buy a coffee online or something like that. So they really wanted social and political change. They started around the 1980s. They even had a little manifesto where they kind of outlined their philosophy. And a mail group. So they were kind of like groups of people online talking to each other and talking about how could we improve the internet in a way where these large companies don't control everything. Because even back then, all the way back to the 80s, we talk about Facebook and Twitter have too much control online. In the 80s, they saw the writing on the wall, and they saw a future where if there wasn't technology available, then large companies would call the shots, and individuals really wouldn't have much freedom.
And who's this guy?
That is John Gilmore. He's one of the early cypherpunk participants, and he was a big part of the mailing list. So that gives you an idea of these are kind of like, they're the nerdy kind of guys. They're the guys that really love playing with technology, but they also have a really strong belief in how it should be used beyond just practical applications. They're like, this should be used for political change.
So I promise I was listening to all of that. So cypherpunks are the people, is a movement started in the 80s trying to push forward the Ready Player One type mentality towards the future.
Well, yeah, you could almost say.
And the reason I bring that up, I look at him, I'm like, oh, he was in Ready Player One, the movie, not the book, because I'm not that nerdy.
They saw the world of a metaverse
down
the road. Maybe not the same way we would think of it, like Ready Player One. Video games were very basic then, but they did see, hey, people are going to use the internet more and more. And
but the 80s is pre-internet.
Well, that was, I guess, pre-internet, but that was around the time networking was occurring. People were connecting computers, and there was very early versions of the internet, but the World Wide Web.
Facsimiles and
faxes. Universities were starting to network.
Got it.
And so some of these people could see the writing on the wall, and they saw hey, people, and we had payment systems already and telephone lines. So they could see us moving towards something like the internet. Maybe if the internet itself hadn't been really completely developed, but they were people are going to rely on this more and more, and we don't want just a few companies to decide who gets access to that. So how do we, or how people are tracked, or how they use it. And they're we need to build some technology that would provide that. And digital cash was at the core of it, or at least a big part of their conversations. We need a way to do payments in a way that doesn't require permission from anyone.
So, if I'm hearing correctly, please slap me down if this is not right. But it's so they were almost like a social advocacy group for the keeping. I don't want to use the wrong words, but the cyber world, the computer world, decentralized?
Yes, in a way. And they really saw it from the perspective of the technology should be open, it should be known, and it should be available to anyone.
And that's what I meant by decentralized. It's where you don't have the 1984 the man in charge and maybe keep it more altruistic versus seedy and seedy is not the right word, but controlled by the government.
1984 is a great example of what they were entirely against. The idea of a single government or just a group of companies having massive control over individual lives through technology. They wanted the opposite. They wanted to use technology to free people rather than to put them in positions of weakness or servitude. Almost.
And what's interesting though is so the reason I'm what's going on here is because I've seen cypherpunks, the word, or I've heard it, but only in correlation, or not correlation, but in when somebody's talking about NFTs.
Interesting.
And I know that's a whole other conversation, but I just thought cypherpunks was like an NFT art drop.
I actually haven't heard that as much, but I've heard it.
But you're smart, and you're in this world. I'm not, and I'm brand new to it.
Yeah, well, that's good to know because I wasn't aware that it was getting associated there. But yeah, I mean,
for me at least, for me. But I didn't. But that's because I didn't realize. I didn't know this was a thing.
Yeah, cypherpunk goes way. It's pre-Bitcoin. It's a very. It's kind of, and it's still evolved over the years.
I know that now.
Yeah. But yeah,
and so do you.
Yeah, and that's where Bitcoin later comes out, is people that were part of the Cypherpunk group became some of these early innovators. So you had these early attempts at creating e-money. So you had Digicash that was created by David Chaum. That a lot of these were kind of like initial failures. They were experimented on, they were cool, but they didn't really take off as money for certain reasons, sometimes technical, sometimes like business or social. B-money was created by someone named Wei Dai, who's another concept. And while all these innovations were happening in the 90s, you did have the internet and web boom. So people were starting to become aware of it. And Milton Friedman, who's a very famous economist, he came up with a lot of monetary theories still being used today. He predicted the rise of something like an e-money, and he described something very similar to Bitcoin, a reliable e-cash that wasn't going to be controlled by any one entity. So you kind of had a lot of this thought around we're going to have some form of digital money, not just relying on banks and payment providers, but some money that is like internet-centric, that lives in the cyberspace, that people can use for purchasing things online and other business like that. So there was this realization that was needed, that it was potentially possible to create, but people were still experimenting a lot, and they hadn't quite found the right mix.
Right. So I think my biggest takeaway so far is, because I'm looking at numbers up here, you're seeing 1980, 1993, 98, 99. Bitcoin was started, what, 08?
08.
So, like, there's obviously this progress. And I know our first episode, we talked about, the 1500s all the way up to 1973. So there's this progression of where we're getting to. But it's fascinating that even as early as the 80s, that's when the digital push to get to where we are with Bitcoin now is.
Yep, I would say that was definitely like where the realization of if something like a Bitcoin was important, and like there was work to get close to it, and everything that built up to Bitcoin leads back to this. Like there were little pieces of Digicash and B-money, and even some thoughts in the economic sphere that eventually led to what Bitcoin became. So you even had other pieces like Hashcash that was created as an anti-spam mechanism. So this is where people were like, hey, if I send you an email, there's nothing that really costs me to send an email. So what if I just sent everyone in the world, every email I could find, some fungal cream, and it doesn't cost me anything, and some of them will write back. And so you had all the spam running around in the early email days, and some people were saying, hey, what if you attach a little bit of work that you need to do to send an email, like something that was trivial, like a CAPTCHA, for example, but like something that a computer does, a little bit of work a computer has to do to send an email. And then, sending 1, 2, maybe even 100 emails is trivial, but if you're sending thousands, then it actually is going to take so much work that it wouldn't be worth spamming people. So these ideas of how do you prevent spam on an open distributed network were being experimented with, and that would play into Bitcoin. And then another creator, Hal Finney right here, who's a very early cryptographer and ended up being one of the first users of Bitcoin, was playing with some proof of work mechanisms. So working on Hashcash to figure out how would you build a proof of work mechanism. And then BitGold, which was created by Nick Szabo in 2004, built on top of Hal Finney's proof of work mechanism. Now, BitGold was very similar to Bitcoin. It was probably the closest thing to Bitcoin before Bitcoin itself became created, but it did have a few problems for how the network was going to be managed in a distributed way. So this is all kind of leading up to Bitcoin, and Satoshi is someone that we believe was looking at all this work and incorporating it. In fact, he references some of this work right here in his white paper.
Before we move on, and if this question is going to be addressed in future modules, feel free to be like, we'll get to that later. Because I hear proof of work, stake of work, or what, all those different terms all the time. Do you have a 30-second definition of proof of work?
Yes. So proof of work is you have to do a little bit of computation to participate in a distributed system. So let me break that down to something simpler. If you show up to a night of drinks with your friends, you throw in a bit of money to participate. And you don't just get to show up, and basically bad actors will typically not act against a system they've invested in. So if you have to throw in a little bit of money, and in order to like be a part of the decision-making process, you're probably not going to make bad decisions because your money's at stake. Proof of work forces you to do work in order to be a part of, in this case, the Bitcoin system, or how Bitcoin processes transactions. And because you've had to put in that work, you're going to be acting in the best interest of Bitcoin. And basically, someone can't come in and make a lot of decisions without having to put up a lot of work.
Is that like the mining?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So proof of work is basically just mining.
Got it.
Yeah. So this idea of proof of work was all getting experimented with prior, and then Bitcoin, surreptitiously around the same time as the financial crisis, came onto the scene. So you had the Great Recession, Lehman Brothers was failing, and then you had this kind of environment where suddenly the white paper drops in 2008. So there's this mailing group, another cryptography mailing group with a lot of cypherpunks on it, where Satoshi Nakamoto dropped the Bitcoin peer-to-peer cash system white paper. And it was only about 7 to 8 pages, maybe 14, not a long paper, but he went over the system where he said, hey, I've taken a lot of ideas, including Hashcash and B-Money that he referenced explicitly, and said, I've created this system where we can create digital money that we can transfer between each other without anyone else being involved. And it's a distributed network, no one will control it. And essentially from there, it was a very small group. Probably only a dozen or so people were like involved in reading about Bitcoin in the very beginning. Maybe a few hundred, I'd have to look at the numbers, but super small, kind of almost silent drop of this white paper. But it specifically said we'll do peer-to-peer payments. We won't have double spending, which means that I won't spend money twice, essentially. And that's a very big part of the white paper. We've solved the double spend problem, or that's what Satoshi is claiming.
What is the double spend problem?
The idea of a double spend problem is what happens. So basically, let's say we're doing digital payments, and I have a digital version of $1 on my laptop, and I want to send you my digital version of $1. You now have $1. But with computers, you can copy data. I can copy a movie, for example, and copy it thousands of times. So what if I send you that money? But then I take a copy of that same money I had sent you and send it to another person. I've spent the same money twice, and that is kind of in a way counterfeiting, or at some point maybe those two people reconcile and one of them realizes they lost out. So we need to prevent double spending. We need to let people do peer-to-peer payments without any one person deciding, who's actually spent properly, but we do need to make sure that everyone spends properly and doesn't try to essentially commit fraud with a double spend attack. So it's kind of it's something that comes up in digital payments, and it's a reason that you have like in the case of a bank, they have a central record that they can compare against to make sure that people don't spend the same money twice. And if you spend it once, we update the ledger book to make sure we know you've already sent it. So when you try to send it again, the ledger book will say, no, you've sent that money, you don't have it. Bitcoin does that, but without a central ledger, it does it with a distributed ledger. And finally, having a chain of transactions or blocks that are secured with proof of work. So the idea being, if you have a ledger book and you're adding pages to that ledger, let's say every day of transaction is one page, you keep that order consistent because if you mix up the pages, then suddenly the payments don't make sense anymore. And so because it's digital, you don't, someone could digitally try to mix it up and then submit it and say this is valid. So what essentially a blockchain is it's just one block is one page in a ledger book with transactions. One page after that, so a series of blocks of transactions that are chained together with proof of work.
And then as you add more ledgers, more pages, you're essentially adding more blocks to the chain.
Exactly. That is a blockchain. So it's a way to create a ledger that can be shared amongst distributed participants and secure, but no single person controls it.
And then is like and again, I'm going to use a word that I have no clue what it means, but like, do the nodes, are they the ones that house all that data?
Yes.
For the entire ledger?
Yep. Every Bitcoin node, every full Bitcoin node has the entire history of the blockchain, all the way down to 2009 when it first started.
And like how much hard drive space is that?
About 500 gigabytes or something like that.
Is it?
Yeah.
So it's less than a terabyte.
I think so.
But I guess with that, it's all it is just ones and zeros.
Well, it's 1 megabyte every 10 minutes. 1 megabyte, and that's a transaction. That's the pace at which the Bitcoin blockchain grows.
Right, but I'm just thinking in terms of, okay, this one video is probably going to be 50 gigs.
Yeah.
Which is 1/10 of the entire Bitcoin blockchain.
Yep.
So it's just fascinating to me, like, okay, 20 or whatever, 14, 15 years worth of data, 13 years worth of data is less, or is just barely more than what this video is.
Yep. It's a very different system. It's really just the fact that Bitcoin transactions are very simple. They're just, I sent this amount data from this person to this person with some cryptographic guarantee on top that says that lets you verify it. That's all it is.
The cryptographic guarantee? That's just
A signature from a private key.
okay.
And we'll dig into that later. That's because there's a whole segment on like what blockchain is, what transactions are, what private keys are. But
What blows my mind most about this slide is there's an email on it.
yeah,
Does anybody reply to that email?
he used to. He went dark in 2010. We don't know where Satoshi went.
Really?
But he was he used there are
CIA got him.
yeah, but there's a lot of people that publish emails from him. So we actually have a long track of both his emails and some forum posts that he made.
So, and this is going to be really ridiculous, maybe a little tangenty, but like I went to bitcoin.org the other day, and they have a website. So if it's open source, who's managing the website?
It's really a community. So it used to be like, Satoshi had a lot of the control. He did a lot of the initial setup, but he when he left, he handed it off to another developer that he was working with, and that developer didn't really want to take complete ownership because he felt like it was beyond just him.
Right.
So he kind of opened it up to the community, and so there's like a lot of different people that own both the GitHub where the code is hosted for the Bitcoin nodes, and the website, and it's all very community oriented. There's no single person that really owns what's going on in the Bitcoin space, and the network itself, of course, is distributed.
Right. And so, because we talk about blockchain, we talk about Bitcoin a lot, and I know sometimes, I think for the most people, it's the same thing. I understand it's completely separate, but is the Bitcoin '08 movement, is that what really pushed the blockchain? Or is it both at the same time? Or am I asking the wrong question?
I think it's both at the same time. Really, Bitcoin was the thing that was produced, and blockchain was just the piece that made it work.
Because I keep hearing through different people, through the conversations we have here at the Texas Blockchain Council, is if you look at how impactful the internet craze, the internet boom, how much of a revolution that was for everything, blockchain is going to be more so than what the internet was.
Yes.
That's what I hear.
That's what I hear. Yeah, and I think that is going to be through Bitcoin and potentially through other things as well. But I think Bitcoin is kind of the first, and it's still the very, one of the most relevant for that. So really, it's just someone did something incredibly innovative through Bitcoin using blockchain, and there are potential uses for blockchain elsewhere. But I think that it does come back to, it's not just the technology, but also the network that it's created. So the Bitcoin network, both the miners and the nodes that support it, as well as like a community that does development, that uses it and spends it, that's another big part of what has really made Bitcoin stick. And that's after this is where we dive into where the community goes from there. So this is the last slide we have.
Oh, this is the last slide. So
yeah. So from here we will talk more about where Bitcoin begins and where it's really grown. This is its birth, and from here it starts to grow up.
So what are some? When's the right time to ask? What are some myths, and what is Bitcoin versus what is not Bitcoin? Is that later on, or is that now?
I think that's later on. Yeah.
Okay.
But right now, nothing in the world has existed prior to Bitcoin being created as far as blockchain. And from there, eventually Bitcoin gets to the point where people realize, what Bitcoin has is really transformative. Maybe there's different ways to use that same technology.
So people took the white paper of Bitcoin, and the revolution there was, yes, it's Bitcoin, but the revolution is not the right word, but the blockchain aspect of it, we can apply this to everything.
Potentially.
And then that's where everybody's mind blew up and was like, oh my, that's the craze, that's the revolution.
That's the craze. But I think there's also this ongoing debate of just how, is it just enough to copy that technology and apply it elsewhere, or do you need to figure out how to carry that network forward? Because I could create I can copy the Bitcoin code, because it's open source, and create my own Bitcoin network easily. But how valuable is that if it's just me and my mother running a node? It's not going to be nearly as trustworthy as the Bitcoin chain today that has all this, the largest community in terms of mining power.
And how many nodes are there?
Thousands of people running nodes, verifying transactions. And the best part about Bitcoin is the fact that I could take out 99% of the nodes, and as long as just one survived, that copy of the ledger can essentially be rebuilt through a new network and continue to let everyone continue to use their transactions. So it's incredibly resilient. There's really almost no feasible way to destroy Bitcoin.
And this might be later on, but forgive me, but okay, so say there's 50 nodes over here, 50 nodes over here. these go down for a day, these continue going on, these get turned back on. How do you validate which one's right?
Who has the longest chain? So who has the most blocks with the most proof of work on them? Okay. So basically, it's like, okay, this guy's at block 200, this guy's at block 190. This is the chain.
And then it just
so
copies that?
Well, yeah, they'll just sync the blocks, they'll validate the blocks, and then they'll catch up, and then we're on the same page where we validate the next block at the same time. Mm-hmm. Or everyone, one miner is going to get by solving a proof of work, they're going to get permission to mine the next block, and then everyone else checks that they've done that correctly. And that's the way the system grows over time. And we'll dig into that in detail later, but that's kind of the starting point for how it all works.
So, random question. Well, not random question, but what are the questions that I didn't ask that should have been asked?
I think the only serious question that has come up before is where is this going, or really why did Satoshi do this? And that's the answer we really don't have, or that's a question we really don't have an answer for.
Well, I think we have it. Just go back to a couple slides of the Cypherpunks, and then to me, that's my why. I mean, obviously, I'm Satoshi.
No. Actually, I phrased that wrong. I think the question is like, what was his? Really, who was he? I think that actually, what I should say is, who was Satoshi? And the answer is, we don't know.
Right.
We just know what he did, and we know some of the writings of why he did it. And beyond that,
there rumors that it's the CIA or something?
There's rumors at CIA. There's rumors that he was Hal Finney, for example. There's rumors that he was several other people that were like involved in Bitcoin early on. It's kind of a wild list if you go down it, but we very well will never know.
So the only guarantees is it's not you, it's not me.
I mean, I don't know if that's even a guarantee.
Oh, who knows? Who knows?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to prove.
It's like Michael be like,
nah. I was too young back then.
Yeah, well, same. Well, that's, man, it's funny is like, because we keep going on, and it's like, and I've said it several times. I don't know if I've said it on camera, but the whole, for me to do this with the Texas Blockchain Council is that whole Zoolander, but why male models, So it's like, I kind of want to do that, but at the same time, it's like, well, we haven't really gotten into anything that's too, out of depth. It's just, I think if you break it down, it's like, oh, well, that makes sense. Oh, that makes sense. We talked about the history, and we literally, where we went from goats to gold to fiat, and now we've gone from goats to gold to fiat to digital.
Yep.
So it makes sense. As far as reading the white paper, because I still haven't done that, which I probably am a bad guy. Like, how many times does a non-tech person have to read it to understand what it means?
It's a good question. It definitely depends on who you, like you personally. I think everyone should definitely read it and try to understand what they can. There's going to be pieces that you don't understand. There's even little snippets of code, but I don't think that's the really important part. I think the important part is reading his motivations and figuring out, hey, what are these terms that he defined a lot of these terms that ended up forming, like he chain of blocked, for example, is some of the terminology he formed. He never said blockchain actually in the paper, but he did reference that kind of a data structure that eventually became known as blockchain. So you kind of see the origin for a lot of terminology that eventually becomes very commonplace in crypto start in this paper.
So what do you think is the most impactful thing? It's the same question I asked you for the first episode. From this segment?
I would say to know that like Bitcoin was built over time from a lot of different people. It was open source in the sense that a lot of open contributions to society for how to create digital money came out of multiple people, and it all kind of got curated into what Bitcoin became by Satoshi. But he worked on existing work that had come before, and it was in response to a world that was becoming increasingly digital. But it wasn't a digital world that a lot of people actually had any stake or ownership of. They were just going to, it was going to be large companies at that point, and maybe even now, that are going to control most things. So the cypherpunk movement and Satoshi didn't want that sort of world for I think anything, but most especially for monetary policy and for how people do payments. And that was, I think, their biggest motivation.
Well, awesome. Well, thanks everybody for watching. Check out the Texas Blockchain Council. They're the ones that are putting all this on. Texas Blockchain Council is advocacy for the the advocacy for blockchain technology within Texas. So if you're in Texas, check it out. If you're out of Texas and want to do business in Texas, check it out. Website at the bottom. I'm Ryan.
I'm Michael.
Thanks for being here. We'll see you next time.